What truth could be so terrible it must be kept behind locked doors? The people of Amuaka village still whisper this question when the wind rustles through the trees at night, carrying with it the scent of old secrets and sorrow. The question clings to the old hut on the far end of the village, the one with the cracked walls and a door that once bore the mark of chains. Children are warned never to play near it, and even the elders avert their eyes when they pass by, as though the past could still reach out and claim them. This is where she lived. The woman in the hut. For years, no one saw her walk among the yam fields or gather at the river with the other wives. No one heard her voice in the market or saw her light a lantern at the community gatherings. She was known only by whispers and shadows, the cursed wife, some said. The mad one, others claimed. Her name was Ezen, and for nearly a decade she was a ghost in her own village. They say she wasn't always like that. That once she was full of life, laughter like the song of birds, beauty that made suitors line up beyond the gates. But all of that changed the day she married Nduka, a quiet man whose wealth and influence masked the stillness in his eyes. He built her a hut beside his compound, promising privacy, peace, and protection. But that peace soon turned into silence, and that privacy became a prison. The door was locked. The windows sealed. No one asked questions. The villagers didn't interfere. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was easier to believe the stories, that she was dangerous, touched by spirits, or cursed with a madness that made her a threat to herself and others. It was easier that way. Easier to let her disappear behind the door, behind the lie. Even her own family stopped asking about her. Her sister, Amaka, once her closest friend, never came again. Years passed like that. Seasons changed, harvests came and went, but the door remained locked. Ezen's voice grew quieter until even the walls seemed to forget what it sounded like. The villagers moved on with their lives, but behind that door time stood still. What kept her there? What truth did Nduka fear so much that he would imprison his own wife? Then came the day the door creaked open. It wasn't the villagers who freed her. It wasn't even her family. It was fate, or maybe something darker. Nduka, the man who locked her away, died suddenly, his body found slumped over his writing desk with no sign of illness or injury. His death was as quiet and strange as his life. And with him gone, the lock on the hut lost its power. Ezen stepped out into the daylight, skin pale from the absence of sun, eyes wide and wild with the weight of too many silent years. The village watched her with stunned disbelief. This was no mad woman. This was someone who had survived something unspeakable. And she had not forgotten. She did not scream. She did not run. She walked, slowly, purposefully, back to the house where Nduka had once lived. The house where he had written letters late into the night. The house that held the only clue to why he had locked her away. That's where she found it. A small, carved box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Nduka's study. It was strange, almost ceremonial, with symbols she didn't recognize and a lock that shimmered with a metallic sheen. She knew immediately that it was not just a box, it was a container of secrets. Of silence. Of everything he never wanted her to see. The key was hanging around his neck when they buried him. Ezen retrieved it in the dead of night. What she found inside changed everything. A letter. Addressed not to her but to her sister, Amaka. The one who never visited. The one who stopped writing. The one who vanished from her life the same time the door was locked. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled like an old cloth, thread by thread. And with it came the realization that her story was never just about love or loss. It was about betrayal, about the silence people choose when the truth is too terrible to face. It was about the cost of trust and the price of secrets. So now we return to the question, what truth could be so terrible, it must be kept behind locked doors? As you listen to Ezen's story, remember that in every family, every village, every heart, there are doors best left unopened, and some that demand to be shattered. If this tale has already gripped you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more haunting African folktales where the line between myth and memory is thinner than you think. Adana had once been the light of Omuokiri. Her laughter carried over the yam fields, her dancing feet turned every festival into celebration, and her eyes, so full of mischief and warmth, captured the hearts of all who saw her. She was the one young girls aspired to be like and young men dreamed of winning over. But that was before. Now, when people in the village speak of her, it is only in hushed tones. Their eyes avoid the narrow path that leads to the edge of the village, where a small, lonely hut stands, its mud walls cracked, its thatched roof sun-bleached and weary from the years. The door always closed. The single window barred. The silence around it as thick as the humid air before a storm. That is where Adana lives. Or survives. Or is kept. No one truly knows anymore. Some say she went mad after her wedding. Others whisper of curses, of spirits that whispered to her in the night and drove her to lunacy. A few even suggest she committed some ancient crime, and her husband Ozoemena was forced to lock her away to protect the village. But these are only stories, shadows people use to explain what they do not understand. Because the truth, the real truth, has remained buried for years. Adana herself barely remembers the moment the door first closed. It was after their wedding, a quiet affair despite her once boundless joy. She had imagined a grand celebration, one where the drums echoed through the hills and her sister Amaka would lead the procession. But Amaka had left the village just weeks before, and no one would tell Adana where she had gone. Ozoemena offered no explanation, only a promise that some things are best forgotten. In the days that followed, Adana began to change. She asked too many questions. She wandered where she shouldn't. She tried to find out what happened to her sister. And one day, Ozoemena brought her to the hut at the edge of the village. He told her she needed rest, time alone to recover herself. He said it would only be for a little while. The door closed behind her. It has not opened since. Years passed. Seasons shifted. Children who once danced near the compound grew into adults who avoided it entirely. No one visited the hut, not even her old friends. The only face Adana saw was her husband's, still young, still strong, still silent. He would come with bowls of food, always without a word, and leave them just inside the door. Sometimes he would sit with her in silence, watching her as though searching for something. Other times he would simply leave. She stopped asking questions after the first year. Her voice had grown tired of echoing off empty walls. Inside the hut, time was a cruel trickster. The days blurred into nights, the seasons into shadows. She would count raindrops on the roof or whisper old songs to the spiders in the corners just to stay sane. She built her world from memories, of her childhood, her mother's voice, the games she and Amaka used to play under the Udala tree. Amaka. The name became her anchor. Her only connection to the life she once had. She often dreamed of her sister, walking down the road, calling her name, arms wide for embrace. But the dreams always ended the same, with Amaka vanishing in a swirl of smoke, her voice stolen by the wind. Adana would wake with tears streaming down her cheeks, clutching the small wooden comb Amaka once gave her, the last gift before her sudden disappearance. She never believed Amaka had left of her own will. They were inseparable, bound not just by blood but by soul. They shared secrets, dreams, and fears. There had been no warning, no farewell. Just gone. And Ozoemena's refusal to speak of it only deepened the wound. She suspected he knew something. Perhaps he was even the reason. Despite the silence and the solitude, Adana did not let madness claim her. She held on to herself, even as the days ground her spirit down like river stones worn smooth. She carved marks into the wall to track time. She recited old tales and invented new ones. She whispered to the moon. She waited. Outside, the world continued. The villagers avoided the path to her hut. They told their children to stay away from the woman in the walls. Some believed she had died long ago, that the figure they saw through the tiny barred window was her ghost. Others pitied her but did nothing. Fear, shame, and tradition held their tongues. And Ozoemena? He thrived. His farm expanded. His name was respected in the village council. He never remarried. When asked why, he would simply shake his head and say, "The heart can only hold one." But no one knew what kind of love could live behind locked doors. One rainy evening, Adana sat by the tiny window, watching the storm paint the world in streaks of gray. A flash of lightning lit the compound, revealing the overgrown Udala tree and the broken pot by the doorstep. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her. Not anger, not sorrow, but resolve. Something was coming. A shift in the wind. A crack in the silence. Her heart, once dulled by isolation, now beat louder. She didn't know why. Not yet. But soon she would. Because truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. And the day was coming when Adana would walk through that door once more, not as a prisoner but as a reckoning. She just didn't know that the key to her freedom was the very sister she thought she had lost. The sky tore open as if the gods themselves had grown tired of holding back their fury. Wind howled through the village of Umuokiri like a wounded beast, tearing roofs from huts, toppling trees like stalks of millet. The storm was no ordinary one. It bore the weight of something ancient and unspoken. Thunder cracked the sky in two, and lightning struck the Udala tree near the old hut at the village's edge. Inside that crumbling hut, Adana crouched against the far wall, clutching her arms around her knees. She had lived through storms before, many in fact, but never one like this. The walls shook as if the earth itself was trying to breathe, to exhale the secrets buried within them. A beam snapped above her head and rain poured in like a wave. Then the door that had stayed shut for years, no matter how hard she had pushed, pulled, or cried, finally gave way with a moan and a crash. The lock, rusted and long forgotten, shattered against the ground. Silence followed. Not the silence of peace but of held breath. Adana stood slowly, barefoot, trembling, and stepped outside. The air was thick with smoke and rain. The earth beneath her feet felt different, softer somehow, like she was walking on memory. The village had changed. The path was overgrown, houses looked unfamiliar. Children she once knew would now be grown or gone. Her feet carried her forward without thinking. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to go. She had to see, to know what the world looked like beyond the frame of the barred window. And then she was there in the village square. Everything stopped. The wind quieted, the rain slowed, and every eye turned to her. Men carrying thatch, women dragging water pots, elders crouched beneath sheltering eaves. They froze at the sight of her. Adana. Hair tangled, skin pale, eyes wide like a newborn antelope. A woman who had vanished long ago. A name only whispered when telling cautionary tales to children. And now here she was, walking through the storm like a ghost come to life. Some dropped their things. One woman screamed and ran. Others simply watched, too stunned to speak. Adana felt the weight of their stares but kept moving, her limbs wooden from disuse, her breath ragged. She reached the main road and turned toward her old compound. But it was empty. Deserted. Her husband, Ozoemena, was nowhere to be found. His tools lay scattered, the compound overgrown. Rain splattered against a half-collapsed roof, but there was no trace of him. No cloak. No sandals. No signs of struggle, just gone. As if the storm had swallowed him whole. Her heart pounded, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. She stood there for a long time, the rain soaking her to the bone, before turning toward the only place she could think of. Mama Chibundu's hut. The old woman had been a neighbor in Adana's youth, a kind-eyed matron who used to give the girls pawpaw slices when they fetched water. If anyone remembered her kindly, it would be Mama Chibundu. She reached the hut and knocked feebly. A moment passed before the curtain parted and the old woman's wrinkled face appeared. Her eyes widened with disbelief. "Adana?" she whispered, voice trembling. Adana nodded, lips barely able to form words. "Please? I don't know where to go." Mama Chibundu pulled her in without another word, wrapping a faded shawl around her shoulders and sitting her by the fire. "We thought you were dead, child," she murmured, heating a bowl of broth. "You look like you've seen the underworld and come back." "I think I have," Adana said softly, staring into the flames. "Where is he? My husband?" The old woman shook her head. "Gone. Disappeared with the wind, like the devil fleeing daylight. Some say the storm took him. Others say he ran." Adana looked up. "And Amaka?" Mama Chibundu froze. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and the patter of rain on the thatched roof. "You truly don't know?" she asked, voice heavy. Adana's heart dropped. "Know what?" Mama Chibundu sighed and placed the steaming bowl before her. "Amaka came back years after you were locked away. She was changed. Not the bright-eyed girl you used to speak of. No one knew where she had gone or what had happened, but when she returned, she avoided your compound like it was cursed. She lives alone now, far from the village center. Doesn't speak to many. Why didn't she come for me?" Adana whispered, tears beginning to form. "I don't know, child. But there's more. She came back with something." "What?" "A child." Adana blinked, stunned. "A child?" "Amaka has a child." "Yes. A girl. She named her Adiz. Looks just like you did when you were young." Adana's hands shook as she clutched the shawl tighter around her. Memories rose like smoke. Amaka's sudden disappearance, the silence from Ozoemena, the night she was locked away. Could it be? "She never spoke of the father," Mama Chibundu added gently. "People guessed, of course. Whispered. But no one dared ask. She kept to herself. That's all I know." Adana sat in stunned silence, a fire kindling in her chest. The storm may have broken her prison, but it had also opened a door into something far more terrifying, the truth. Whatever had happened all those years ago, it was not madness that put her in that hut. It was something else. And now she had questions. Questions only Amaka could answer. Outside, the storm began to die, but in Adana's heart, another one had just begun. The rain had passed, but its shadow lingered, Puddles shimmered like spilled secrets, and the air was thick with questions. Adana moved through the village slowly, still wrapped in Mama Chibundu's shawl, as if it could shield her from stares sharper than spears. People no longer screamed at the sight of her, but they still stepped aside. Some offered nods, polite, cautious, unsure whether to believe she was woman or wraith. And then there was Amaka. Her name rolled off tongues like praise and poison. Amaka the Blessed, they called her. The Lioness of Umuokiri. She had risen from silence to become the village's most influential woman, wealthy, poised, with servants who obeyed before she even spoke. Her compound was guarded like a shrine, her face rarely seen, her words carried like gospel through her messengers. No one mentioned Adana when speaking to her. No one dared. It was as if her sister's existence had been erased from history, like a shameful stain scrubbed clean. Adana learned this slowly, painfully, in overheard conversations and veiled glances. She sent word to Amaka twice. The first time, the messenger returned pale-faced and silent. The second time, the note was never acknowledged. And so Adana watched from a distance. From the small corner in Mama Chibundu's home, she observed the village shift around her. Every day, Amaka's carts rolled through the market, loaded with fine goods from distant places. She had control over trade, over land, even over the council of elders. Her compound was a fortress of polished wood and silk curtains, adorned with brass that shimmered in the sun. There were feasts, celebrations, and stories told of her generosity. Yet none spoke of where she had been during the years Adana was locked away, or who the father of her daughter was. Adana's hands trembled each time she thought of the child, Adiz, a girl who bore her face, a girl raised by the sister who had once promised to protect her. Questions swirled in her mind. Why had Amaka returned alone years ago? Why had she never fought for Adana's freedom? Why did Ozo Emina disappear the day the hut broke open? Answers she knew would not come freely. And so, like a hunter stalking the shadows, Adana began her quiet search. She started with the elders, the few who still remembered her as more than a rumor. Old Papa Eek, the storyteller who now walked with a cane and spoke through sighs. He told her of the days when Ozo Emina courted both sisters, though his eye lingered longer on Adana. Jealousy, he suggested, had taken root early. Your sister was always proud, he rasped. But pride can rot into something darker when watered by envy. Then there were the temple keepers, guardians of old tales. Most turned her away, wary of what she sought. But one, a quiet woman named Nkiru, allowed Adana into the back room of the shrine. You deserve truth, she whispered. Even if it cuts. In that dim space, among scrolls of myths and lineage, Adana found pieces of herself buried in ink. One scroll detailed a tale nearly forgotten, a story of two sisters, one sacrificed for the other's gain. It spoke not in names but the echoes were there. A sister taken by darkness, it read, so another may rise in light. Another scroll bore the crest of her family, an old, faded emblem of a rising moon, and beneath it, an entry scrawled in haste, Amaka returns alone. Pregnant. Claims divine favor. Elders warned not to question. Fear in Ozo Emina's eyes. Adana clutched the parchment with trembling fingers. Her husband had feared her sister? Or what she carried? Pieces began to fall into place. Ozo Emina had visited her less and less in those final years. His eyes had always seemed haunted. The way he avoided her gaze, the way he muttered under his breath when leaving the hut. He was not a cruel man, not at first. But fear changes people. And guilt destroys them. Could it be that he knew? Did he help lock her away not because of madness or possession, but because he had betrayed her? Because Amaka had returned with a secret that could destroy them all? And now, years later, with him vanished, Adana was the only one left who remembered the beginning. She turned her search to older villagers, the quiet ones who kept stories like seeds in their teeth. One, an old midwife, whispered that Amaka had come to her in the dead of night, swollen with child and trembling with rage. She didn't cry once during birth, the woman said, eyes distant. But after the child came, she whispered something to it. Now the crown is mine. Adana left that night with the words echoing in her ears. She returned to Mama Chibundu's hut, heart pounding, hands aching with rage and sorrow. She now knew something terrible had happened, something beyond a mere betrayal. Amaka had not just turned her back. She had orchestrated something. She had risen by burying the truth alive. And now Adana was no longer content to stay in the shadows. The next morning before dawn she stood near Amaka's compound, not to be seen but to watch. She saw Adiz, graceful and bright, dancing in the yard. The child's laughter pierced her heart like a blade. Her face, so familiar, so like hers, it couldn't be coincidence. Was the child hers? Or worse, was she born from a union meant to erase Adana entirely? The storm had opened more than a door. It had peeled back the roof of a carefully built lie. And now, as the village basked in the glow of Amaka's reign, Adana stood in the ashes of a truth too heavy to bear. But she would bear it. She would find the full truth, even if it shattered what little was left of her heart. The wind rustled the leaves with whispers that day, low, ancient murmurs that seemed to echo the voices in Adana's head. She was no longer the quiet woman who had emerged trembling from a broken hut. Something within her had sharpened, like stone ground slowly against stone, steady, painful, inevitable. Every thread she'd followed had pulled her closer to a tapestry of betrayal. But what she uncovered next would tear the last shreds of illusion apart. It began in the back room of Mama Chibundu's compound. The old woman had allowed Adana to stay longer than planned, and one evening, while clearing out a forgotten chest of moth-eaten fabric and cracked pottery, Adana's hand brushed against a stack of old books, mildewed, brittle, and tied together with twine. At the bottom was a leather-bound journal. Her mother's name was scratched into the front cover in faded ink, Uzo Amako Eziani. The sight of it made her hands tremble. She sat down slowly on the straw mat, heart pounding in her chest like a war drum, and opened to the first page. It was a mother's musings at first, notes about harvests, prayers for her daughters, recipes written in a rushed hand. But deeper within, as the entries grew more frantic, Adana found the edges of a terrible truth. She read in silence, the pages whispering to her like ghosts. Amaka fights me now. She will not accept the betrothal. She says she has her own dreams. But we made the pact with Ozoemina's family. The bride price has been paid. This union must happen, or our family will fall into disgrace. Adana's fingers curled tighter around the edges. She read on. Today she came to me with a plan. A cruel one. She says Adana is of marrying age too. She says Ozoemina barely knows our faces apart. That if the ceremony is done in dim candlelight, none will question it. I argued. I screamed. But in her eyes I saw only resolve. She calls it freedom. I call it betrayal. The journal nearly fell from her lap. Her breath caught. The room spun. She had been traded like livestock, not just by a man but by her own sister. A life reshaped by shadows, forged by lies. There were more entries, each one bleeding with heartbreak and helplessness. I watched as they dressed Adana in the marriage cloth. I watched as Ozoemina took her away, believing she was the girl he had longed for. Amaka looked on silent. When I asked her if she felt anything at all, she said only this: she will be fine. He's gentle. Adana covered her mouth as the sob escaped. So it was true. Amaka had given her away, stolen her name, her future, her freedom. Also she could be free from an arranged marriage. Also she could rise to power on a lie built on a sister's sacrifice. And Ozoemina. He had known. The journal continued with entries darker still. There are whispers now. That Adana speaks strangely. That she cries at night and won't eat. That Ozoemina looks sick with guilt. He came to me once, begged me to tell him what to do. I told him the truth must come out. But he refused. He said she would break if she knew. That it was kinder to let her believe the madness. They had chosen to silence her. Today Amaka said she'd handle it. That Adana's mind was too fragile and the village too curious. She said it would be safer, for all of us, if Adana stayed somewhere quiet. Somewhere locked. It's for her own good, she said. Adana dropped the book. Her vision blurred with tears. Her body trembled not from weakness but fury. For years they had told themselves lies, Ozoemina, Amaka, maybe even her own mother. Lies disguised as protection, as care. But it was betrayal, pure and deliberate. Her life stolen, rewritten, and buried under silence. The journal ended abruptly. The last entry was dated just weeks before her mother's death. I fear what my silence has birthed. Amaka is unrecognizable. Ozoemina walks like a ghost. And my poor Adana. May the gods forgive me. Adana rose slowly, every joint aching with the weight of revelation. Outside, the village bustled as always. Market women haggled, children played, and fires crackled. But to Adana the world had changed. She walked through the village in a daze, journal clutched to her chest. People no longer stared as openly, but still they made space for her. Whether out of fear or guilt, she didn't know. She stood before Amaka's compound by dusk. She didn't knock. The guards moved to stop her, but she looked at them, just looked, and they stepped aside. Amaka was seated on a carved stool, sipping palm wine, as if nothing had changed in all the years since she'd handed her sister to a fate worse than death. Her expression faltered when she saw Adana. For a flicker of a second, something like shame cracked through her mask. Adana said nothing. She simply held up the journal. Amaka's hands clenched the wine cup until it cracked. "I see," she whispered. "Do you?" Adana replied, voice cold and low. There was a silence between them, heavy, jagged. Amaka looked away first. "I did what I had to," she said, almost to herself. "They would have ruined me. I had plans. You were always softer. I knew he wouldn't hurt you." Adana laughed, once bitterly. "You knew nothing," she said. "You still don't." She turned to leave, not waiting for more words. Amaka had already said enough, years ago. That night, Adana sat beneath Mama Chibundu's fig tree, rereading the journal by lamplight. And for the first time she understood the true shape of her past. Her cage had never been built from madness or fear, it had been built from another's ambition. From betrayal written in ink, sealed by silence and passed off as fate. But no longer. Tomorrow she would go to the elders. She would read every word aloud if she had to. She would reclaim her name. And this time, it would be her truth that echoed through the village. Not whispers. Not shadows. Truth. The sun was high when Adana returned to the village square, not with trembling limbs or a bowed head, but with fire in her eyes. She walked through the dusty path like someone awakened from a dream she'd been forced to live through, her mother's journal in her arms like a weapon. This time there would be no silence. No hidden truths. No more locked doors. She waited outside Amaka's compound until the guards shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to stop her or step aside. And when they finally did move, it was with eyes cast downward, because everyone had begun to hear the whispers. Inside, the room was cool, fragrant with hibiscus and power. Amaka sat on her carved stool once again, surrounded by tokens of her influence. Gifts from chiefs, golden bangles stacked to her elbows, young attendants at her beck and call. She looked up as Adana entered and dismissed the others with a flick of her wrist. For a moment they just stared at one another. Two sisters, once inseparable, now divided by years, lies, and a wound that pulsed beneath every breath. "I see you couldn't leave it alone," Amaka said, her tone half resigned, half weary. "You should have stayed quiet. It was easier that way." "Easier for you," Adana replied, her voice low, sharp like a blade unsheathed. Amaka's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to. You don't understand what it meant back then. I was cornered. We both were." "No," Adana snapped. "I was offered." "You were cornered, yes, but you threw me in the pit so you could climb out." The room darkened slightly as clouds passed over the sun outside, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Somewhere in the village, drums began to sound, a slow, deliberate rhythm. People were gathering. Word had already begun to spread. Amaka stood. "Do you think this world was ever going to let me be anything other than a wife? Possession? I made a choice, one that saved me from a life of being caged. I built this power with my hands from the ashes of everything they tried to make me." "You built it from me," Adana whispered. "From my suffering. From the years I spent locked in silence and confusion. You survived. No thanks to you." Their voices had risen now, loud enough to carry past the windows. Curious villagers crept close, listening from just outside the compound walls. The confrontation was no longer private. It was becoming public, dangerously so. Amaka moved to the center of the room, her expression hard but her voice shaking. "You think I don't carry guilt?" she said. "Every night I closed my eyes I saw you. Every feast I celebrated your face haunted me. But I couldn't undo it. I chose and I paid for it in ways you'll never know." Adana stepped forward, voice trembling. "You didn't pay. You profited. You sat in glory while I rotted in a dark room, fed like an animal by the man who thought me too fragile to know the truth. You moved through life in silks and gold while I forgot what my own voice sounded like." Silence fell between them again, but only for a breath. Because just outside voices were beginning to rise. "I heard them," said a woman from the crowd. She said Amaka gave her away. Her own sister. The murmurs became waves of scandal. Amaka opened the door herself, stepping out onto the porch to face the growing crowd. Her poise did not falter, but her voice lost its usual command. "Yes," she said loud and steady. "I made a choice many years ago. I did what I had to do to survive in a world that gave women none." There was a hush, thick and heavy. "But at what cost?" someone shouted. "You became the very thing you feared." More voices joined in. She betrayed her own blood. She locked her sister in a hut. She took everything, her future, her name, just to rise. But not everyone jeered. Some, especially younger women, watched Amaka with torn expressions, conflicted between horror at her actions and awe at her rise. After all, in a village where women were traded like cattle, hadn't Amaka done what many secretly wished they could? She took power, a girl whispered near the back of the crowd. She wasn't supposed to. But she did. The elders, meanwhile, stood grim-faced. Their silence was telling. They had benefited from Amaka's leadership, but now the truth threatened to fracture their control. Amaka turned back to Adana. You wanted justice. So here it is. The truth. The judgment of the people. Are you satisfied now? Adana stepped forward slowly, her voice quieter but cutting through the noise like thunder. No, she said. Because this isn't justice. This is chaos. They'll tear you down or lift you higher, but neither path heals what you broke. Then what do you want? Adana held up the journal. I want truth. A full one. Not whispered behind doors. Not buried in shame. I want the village to know how quickly a family can sacrifice its own. And I want you to say it. Out loud. That it was me who paid for your freedom. Amaka's lips parted, but no words came. And then, softly, barely audible, it was you. Adana nodded. The people heard. Some cried. Some shouted. Some stood in stunned silence. Adana didn't stay to hear the debate. She walked away head high, leaving the crowd and Amaka behind. But as she walked through the dusty path, her strength faltered. What had she truly gained? Yes, the truth was out. Yes, the village now saw the wounds buried for years. But justice? Justice remained elusive, twisting in the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished. She sat under the fig tree once more, alone, the journal on her lap. Her heart was tired. Her soul stretched thin. She had broken the silence. But now, she wasn't sure if anything could ever truly fix what had been broken. The night air was heavy with silence, and Adana could not sleep. Her body was still, but her soul drifted, pulled by something older than time. When her eyes closed, the world did not vanish. Instead, it shimmered, shifted, and reformed. She found herself standing barefoot on the soft earth of the sacred forest, the moonlight silver against the leaves, and the trees whispering names not spoken aloud in generations. Before her stood the ancestral council, shimmering forms cloaked in feathers, beads, and ancient firelight. Their eyes glowed with the weight of untold wisdom and the burden of long memory. They had summoned her and Amaka, not as sisters but as symbols. Adana in her quiet endurance, and Amaka in her fiery ambition. Amaka arrived not with protest but with resignation. She too had felt the pull of the ancestors, the invisible hand of judgment that no human power could resist. The forest did not echo with anger or wrath, only the stillness of reckoning. A voice, not quite male or female and not quite sound or wind, spoke. Tonight, the truth shall not only be told, it shall be lived. A glowing mist surrounded Amaka, and suddenly she was no longer herself. She was her younger self again, standing at the edge of an unwanted betrothal. She watched herself plead for escape, saw the moment the idea was born, to replace herself with Adana. The spirits made her feel every ripple of her choice, not just her own fear but Adana's pain. She relived the silence of the hut, the loneliness, the slow fading of a sister's voice in the dark. She wept as each year passed in an instant, and with every heartbeat, shame twisted deeper into her. And then the mist surrounded Adana. She was no longer the strong woman standing in judgment. She was a girl again, confused, betrayed, hearing the door bolt shut from the outside. She felt the cold floor, the hunger, the maddening stillness. The bitter taste of wondering why had she been forgotten? Why had no one come? The ancestors didn't just make her remember, they made her inhabit the pain, the betrayal, the loneliness so deep it no longer needed bars to imprison her. When it ended, the forest was quiet. Both women collapsed, trembling, not as adversaries but as reflections of each other. The spirits stood silent, allowing the echoes of their memories to settle in the roots of the trees. Then a question was posed, not by voice but by essence. What should be done? Adana looked at Amaka. The woman who had once betrayed her now knelt with her head bowed, no longer radiant with pride, but stripped of power. The spirits offered her two paths: banish Amaka into silence as she had once been, or restore her own place, take Amaka's role, her influence, her seat of power. But Adana did neither. She stood slowly, meeting the gaze of every ancestor, and spoke. I do not want revenge. I do not want a throne carved from sorrow. I only want the truth remembered, Not hidden, not softened. I want to walk free and I want to live without chains, hers or yours. There was silence again. And then the trees sighed. The wind shifted. The spirits bowed, not as rulers but as witnesses. Adana and Amaka awoke at dawn in the real world, side by side beneath the sacred fig tree. The trial was over. But the healing had just begun. The days that followed moved like a river after a storm, muddy, raw, yet cleansing. The village was no longer silent. Tongues that once feared shame now dared to speak. People gathered not to gawk at scandal but to seek understanding. Adana began walking through the village, not as a ghost, not as a prisoner reborn, but as a teacher. She told her story without anger, only truth. She sat with girls under trees and spoke of betrayal. She sat with boys near the fires and taught them the weight of silence. She told them what it felt like to be forgotten, and why they must remember each other better. She opened a quiet space by the well where anyone could come to tell a truth they had hidden. People came, some with tears, others with apologies. Mothers brought daughters. Elders came to confess secrets buried decades ago. The village began to see itself, not as a place of shame but as one of healing. Amaka, once feared and revered, did what few expected. She stepped down from her place of influence. She stood before the village square and spoke the words no leader had ever dared. I have sinned not just against my sister but against the soul of this village. Power blinded me. Fear hardened me. But I choose now to kneel before the truth, and offer my place to those who will build not with silence, but with memory. She gave up her title. She donated her wealth to build a learning house, where women could learn to lead and men could learn to listen. And Adana? She did not take Amaka's place. She refused. She walked among the people, not above them. And slowly the village began to change. Children who once whispered stories of the madwoman in the hut, now sat around her, wide-eyed, as she spun truths into lessons. The once feared name of Adana became something else, a warning, a hope, a seed. They no longer called her prisoner. They called her keeper of truth. One morning, long after the drums of change had quieted, Adana returned to the edge of the village. The hut still stood in ruins, a hollow echo of its former purpose. Its door had been ripped away by the storm, but its shadow remained in the soil, like a wound never fully closed. She knelt beside it, fingers brushing the broken wood, and began to dig. Not to bury shame, but to plant something else. She took a small sapling from her satchel, young, green, and trembling in the breeze. She planted it with her bare hands, pressing soil around its roots like a mother swaddling a child. It was not just a tree, it was a living story, a marker. When it grew, children would ask what it meant. And they would be told, this is where silence ended. This is where truth grew tall. She sat beside the young tree for hours, watching the wind pass through its leaves. Birds landed nearby but didn't flee. The sky was open and so was her spirit. When the sun began to set, casting gold across the land, Adana rose. She did not look back. She walked beyond the village, over the hills and past the river. She disappeared into the world, leaving no map, no promise of return. But her story remained. The tree grew. The learning house stood. And her name was whispered not with pity but with reverence. A new generation rose, one that knew not to trade silence for comfort, one that remembered the price of betrayal and the value of healing. They told the tale of Adana not as a tragedy but as a guide. And when young girls asked what it meant to be strong, the elders would point to the hills and say, she chose truth when she could have chosen revenge. And that is the kind of power no one can ever lock away. The wind that once howled through the broken hut now whispered gently through the branches of the tree Adana planted. The village, once fractured by silence and deception, had grown quieter, not with fear but with a kind of sacred awareness. Time had moved forward as it always does, but something had shifted in the soil of the land, in the rhythm of conversations, in the stories passed down beneath the stars. Adana was no longer present, but her absence felt intentional, almost divine. She had become part of the lore, her name spoken like a breath in the dusk, her legacy carried by those who dared to remember rather than bury the past. Her tale was no longer one of imprisonment, but of awakening. And it was not just her own spirit that had been freed, it was the collective conscience of a people who had, for too long, turned their faces away from uncomfortable truths. Betrayal is a bitter seed, and when planted by a stranger, it hurts. But when planted by family, by blood, by someone who once cradled your dreams and whispered childhood secrets into your ear, it becomes something else entirely. It does not just wound the flesh. It reaches into the soul and severs roots that once held you steady. That was the pain Adana had carried, not just the years stolen from her, but the knowledge that the one person she had loved without question had offered her up like a lamb for slaughter, all for a seat of power. And yet, what makes Adana's story unforgettable is not just the cruelty she endured, but the choice she made in the aftermath. When the spirits offered her vengeance, when the village's eyes turned to her in righteous fury, she had every reason to cast her sister down and rise in her place. And yet, she did not. Because sometimes, the truest power lies not in rising above others, but in refusing to become what hurt you. She chose truth. Not the kind of truth written in books or spoken in formal gatherings, but the kind that reshapes a community from the inside. The kind that demands silence be broken, not for applause but for healing. She chose to tell her story even when her voice shook. She chose to teach even when the lessons cut close to the bone. She chose to walk free, not into a throne room but into the unknown, holding only her truth as a torch against the darkness. What do we learn from Adana's tale? That silence often protects power. That the most dangerous lies are the ones we choose to live with, just to avoid the noise of truth. And that sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not exposing others, but surviving long enough to speak your name again in your own voice. The village changed because one woman refused to stay locked away, not just behind a wooden door but behind a veil of shame and forgotten history. She became a mirror. And when people saw themselves in her story, they could no longer pretend that her pain was not also theirs. And what of Amaka? Her fall from grace was not as loud as her rise, but it was more meaningful. She did not vanish in disgrace, nor did she become a villain in hiding. She remained in the village, walking with humility, stripped of her titles but not of her humanity. She faced the weight of her actions, not by seeking forgiveness, but by creating space for others to speak. Her repentance was not perfect, but it was real. And that, perhaps, was enough. So now we pose a question to you, dear listener. If you were Adana, and your own sister had bartered your freedom for her rise, would you forgive her? Would you choose the same path, one of truth over vengeance, one of healing over conquest? Or would you let the fire of betrayal burn everything down? There are no easy answers. And that is the point of stories like these, not to tell you what is right but to ask you what kind of person you want to become when faced with impossible choices. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you hear a whisper of injustice or see a soul locked away, whether by fear, silence, or forgotten pain, you'll remember Adana. And you'll ask, what can I do to open that door? Stories have always been more than entertainment in our culture. They are warnings. They are maps. They are sacred containers of truths too raw to speak plainly. This tale, Adana's tale, is not just a tragedy or a myth. It is a reflection. One that asks us all to look inward and ask, what am I choosing to forget? Who am I refusing to forgive? What truth have I buried for the sake of comfort? This is not just her story, it is all of ours. So, if this tale stirred something in you, if it made you ache, reflect, or even question, do not let it end here. Speak. Share it. Comment with your thoughts, your feelings, your truths. Would you have chosen as Adana did? Would you walk away from vengeance even when it sits so easily in your hands? Like this video if the story moved you. Share it with someone who needs to remember that truth, though painful, is the path to healing. And subscribe if you want to hear more haunting, emotional, powerful African folktales, stories that carry the weight of our ancestors and the voice of our future. Because sometimes, the most important doors are the ones we finally choose to unlock. The sun rose gently over the hills, casting soft gold across the village that had once turned its back on a silent woman locked in shadow. But today there was no shadow, no silence. Only a soft breeze rustling the leaves of a young tree rooted in the earth where suffering had once made its home. That tree had not asked to grow there. It had not chosen the story buried beneath it. But it stood anyway, strong, alive, bearing witness to pain transformed. Adana's journey had taken her from laughter to loneliness, from love to betrayal, and finally, to truth. Not the kind of truth people write in scrolls or record in law, but the personal, intimate kind. The kind that hurts before it heals. The kind that demands everything of you and offers no reward except peace. And that is what she found. Not vengeance. Not glory. Just peace. When she left the village, there were no trumpets. No crowds lined the roads. But every soul that watched her disappear into the hills knew they would speak her name for generations to come. Not as a victim. Not as a ghost. But as a woman who walked through fire and did not burn. A woman who faced down betrayal so deep it nearly swallowed her spirit, and still chose not to become bitter. Because that is the final weight of the tale. It is not just a story about what happened to Adana. It is a story about what Adana chose to become when it was all over. So many others in her place would have burned everything down. They would have taken up the mantle of power and used it to exact revenge. They would have pointed to the chains once wrapped around their wrists and said, "Now it's your turn." But Adana broke the cycle. She saw that pain passed on becomes poison, and silence passed down becomes a curse. Her power was not in flames, but in the quiet way she turned toward healing. She faced Amaka and chose not to destroy her, even though she had every reason to. She faced the village and chose not to punish them, even though they had abandoned her. And when the ancestors asked her to decide, she did not choose banishment or revenge. She chose to name the truth, to hold it in the open, and to let it breathe even if it cut through everything people wanted to believe. There is something holy about that kind of courage. In the end, Amaka stepped down. Not in disgrace but in humility. She admitted her sin before those she once ruled. She handed over the legacy she had built on betrayal. And though her journey of atonement would stretch on, she started walking it, with bare feet and no crown. And what of the village? They remembered. That was all Adana had asked of them. Do not forget. Do not look away. And they didn't. The children learned her story. The adults whispered it around fires. The hut that once imprisoned her was never rebuilt. Instead, it was left as sacred ground, marked not by stones or signs, but by the roots of the tree she planted. The land changed. The hearts changed. And maybe that is the real miracle of Adana's story. Not that she survived. Not that she forgave. But that she left behind something better than revenge. She left behind renewal. Because that is what truth can do. It can ruin. It can devastate. It can rip open the seams of what we thought we knew. But if we are brave, if we let the truth breathe, it can also rebuild. It can grow. It can make something new. And now, to you, yes, you listening to this tale. What would you have done? If your sister had stolen your freedom to save herself, would you forgive her? If your village had forgotten you existed, would you return? If your pain had been locked away for years, only to be released with the storm, would you seek vengeance? Or would you, like Adana, plant something in its place? There are no simple answers. And that's why we tell stories. To ask, to wonder, to learn. And maybe if even one person who hears this tale dares to tell their own truth, dares to unlock the door someone else closed, then Adana's journey was not in vain. So let this be the breath that carries her name forward. Let this be the whisper that reminds you, no one should be hidden, forgotten, or silenced. And no lie, no matter how ancient or powerful, can survive forever in the face of truth. Like this video if her strength moved you. Comment with your thoughts, your answers to the question, would you forgive a sister who traded your life for her rise? Share it with someone you know needs to hear that healing is possible. And subscribe to this channel for more chilling, emotional, and unforgettable African folktales, stories where the past walks with the living, and the truth always finds a way to rise. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a story can do is simply be told.